All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's just a couple of minutes after the hour. Welcome to this webinar on the New Apostolic Reformation and the Threat to Democracy, hosted by Political Research Associates, PRA, and our partner organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. My name is Naomi Washington Leapart, and I'm the Strategic Partnerships Director at PRA, and I'm happy to moderate our conversation today. A few notes before we begin. This chat is available. You'll notice that we can't see everybody and we can't hear everybody. You can only see and hear the panelists, but the chat is open to you. It's available for comments, for you to make connections with other people who were here attending this session. So if you haven't already, take a minute now to drop into the chat where you're zooming in from. Where in the world are you? Just so we have a sense of who's in the room. We know we have people listening from all over the world. I want to let you know that after each panelist has presented, we will then transition to a question and answer time. So I want you to, if you have a question, put your question in the Q&A feature down at the bottom where you have your Zoom menu bar. You have Q&A. If you click Q&A, you can type in your question. I will be grabbing those questions at the Q&A time and bringing those questions forward to the panel. So that the question doesn't get lost in the chat, I encourage you to put your question in the Q&A. This conversation is on the record and will be recorded, is being recorded, and we plan to post the recording in the future. So don't worry, you will be able to access the recording in a few. Okay, now, let me orient us just a bit to the New Apostolic Reformation before I turn it over to our panelists. What brings us together today is this movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. And it's not as well known as one might think, given its significance, right? In fact, that's my dog, Coco. So she's just chiming in, zooming in from Philadelphia. In fact, NAR is one of the most important Christian religious and political movements of our time. We're not going to be able to cover everything in this short webinar, but we want to highlight some of the most important elements of this movement. So here's who you'll hear from today. André Gagné is going to tell us about the meaning of spiritual warfare. Peter Montgomery is going to tell us about the NAR's connections to political power in the United States. Julie Ingersoll is going to tell us how to what we need to look out for, or maybe what NAR isn't, right? How do we think about NAR and its long horizon, its long time horizon? Rachel Tabachnik is going to help us resolve the paradox of theocratic libertarianism. And Frederick Clarkson is going to tell us about what the NAR calls the 9-county strategy and how we might counter it. And then we'll close with Anthea Butler, who's going to call us to action in light of all of this. And so I'm going to introduce each presenter more fully right before they speak, but that gives you a sense of the arc of the conversation today. Now, a little more about the NAR. This term, New Apostolic Reformation, was coined in the 1990s by the late C. Peter Wagner, who was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. He observed that Pentecostal and charismatic churches outside of denominational structures were the fastest growing in the US and worldwide. And in those churches, he saw an emerging new paradigm that he and his close associates eventually sought to shape and organize and lead. Now, their vision of the NAR featured more than just networks of independent or non-denominational churches. It actually introduced changes to historically democratic church governance, featuring the restoration of modern-day apostles and prophets. And the NAR vision also draws on beliefs and practices from earlier religious movements, like the Latter Rain movement in Pentecostalism in the post-World War II era, and Christian Reconstructionism, which emerged from Calvinism and introduced dominion theology to the Christian right in the 80s and 90s. Wagner and his associates both introduced novel beliefs and practices, and revised other beliefs and practices. And these steps remain controversial and consequential to this day, such as this notion of strategic level spiritual warfare, which we'll hear our panelists talk more about. Now, some have sought to limit the definition of NAR to the networks and organizations founded by Wagner, but Wagner himself always saw the movement as much broader than that. More recently, we've seen the overt politicization of this very variable movement, which we can see in the Seven Mountain Mandate, which has found resonance in the movement. That's the idea that Christians of the right sort are supposed to take dominion over society by conquering what they call the seven mountains of influence or culture. These are government, religion, the family, education, arts and entertainment, business, and the media. The Seven Mountains metaphor packages a lot of one's complicated theology into a religious and political vision that's easily accessible to wide audiences, many of whom have never even heard of Wagner or NAR. The notion of the Seven Mountains has, according to one 2024 scholarly poll, been spreading rapidly and now dominates evangelical Christianity, even beyond the portion of evangelicals in the charismatic or Pentecostal camp. The Seven Mountain Mandate has thus become a central theme in political organizing around the nation. So again, the NAR is arguably one of the most significant social movements in the history of this country, and it's probably the most significant movement that most people have never heard of. So we're going to dive deep today into NAR because we know that democracy is on the line. What we discuss over the next 90 minutes or so is going to help us defend democracy in the months and years to come. So that just gives you a little bit of grounding in NAR, what we're going to talk about. Each of our panelists is going to take a piece of the NAR puzzle and elaborate. We're going to start with a video presentation by André Gagné. He couldn't be with us in person today, but he did send us a video that we're going to play for you in a minute. Let me tell you about Dr. Gagné. He is the professor and the chair and the professor of theological studies at Concordia University in Montreal. And his teaching and scholarship focuses on political theology, religion and violence, and the interpretation and reception of the Bible. He is the author of the recent book, American Evangelicals for Trump, Dominion, Spiritual Warfare, and the End Times. So here's this short video where Dr. Gagné talks a little bit about this idea of spiritual warfare. Just give me one moment. I'll share my screen. And here we go.
So I'll be talking about the politics of spiritual warfare. As you know, it did make the rounds in the news recently. Lance Wallnau, very prominent NAR figure, talked about Kamala Harris as representing the spirit of Jezebel. And we'll see how Jezebel in just a few minutes is a spiritual warfare trope. This has been picked up. This idea of Jezebel, attacks on Kamala Harris has been rightfully so picked up by the mainstream media. But to have a sense of what that means, there was a book by Michael Brown, who is one who likes to deny the fact that the NAR does not really exist. He's been saying that, unfortunately, a couple of times, but he's wrote a book in 2019 about Jezebel's war with America and the plot to destroy our country and what we can do to turn the tide. Now, if you read the articles in the news, they will tell you how Jezebel is a biblical figure from the Old Testament, and rightly so. But people like Michael Brown and those that practice spiritual warfare see Jezebel not as a person anymore, but a spirit that is alive again today. And if you see in that little paragraph describing his book, it says that the influence of the same demonic force is being felt in the massive increase of pornography and sexual temptation, the militant spirit of abortion, the rise of radical feminism, and more importantly, in the attempt to silence prophetic voices. So they see Jezebel as a demonic force representing what Jezebel did in the Old Testament. But now Jezebel is a supernatural entity that tries to impede on what the church wants to do in America to bring the kingdom of God on earth, essentially, in America, but on earth also. Now, the idea of spiritual warfare is something that C. Peter Wagner really promoted. He wrote a lot on this. You have a bunch of books here. You have at least 10 books that directly deal with the notion of spiritual warfare. This was something very important to him, to the point where he essentially systematized a demonology. Yeah? First of all, it's important for us to have a sense of what this is, what it means for spiritual warfare practitioners. Essentially, it's the idea that there is a cosmic war between good and evil, between God and Satan, between the Christian church and the world system that is ruled by spiritual forces of darkness. And it is an internal and external war. Internal from within, between the Holy Spirit and the lusts of the flesh, but external from without, between supernatural forces of good and evil. And there's always a key text that is quoted, as you probably are familiar with this. Paula White-Cain referred to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, and you have it on the screen. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, to make sense of what spiritual warfare is, Wagner systematized his demonology. Essentially, he talked about 3 levels of spiritual warfare: ground level spiritual warfare, which deals with, what he felt was being, common casting out of demons in people, deliverance ministries. There's also the occult level spiritual warfare that's battling demonic forces related to Satanism or new religious movements, New Age, astrology, occult practices. So they're seen as under the influence of demonic forces. And the last but not least is strategic spiritual warfare. And this is what comes to the fore more and more. It's also called cosmic level spiritual warfare. It's this struggle that is mentioned in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. Often we refer to this in the literature as territorial spirits that keep humans that are found in cities, nations, religious alliances, but also political alliances, political parties, in spiritual captivity. This is why, in the context of politics, the political adversaries are demonized or dehumanized, essentially said to be under demonic forces, or even being demons themselves, manifestations of demons, or where demons would speak through them. You hear this kind of language used in the political context by people that adhere to this kind of idea. Now, the use of spiritual warfare language is significant because, of course, it deals with notions of conquering. One needs to engage in spiritual warfare to control, against demonic forces that essentially control people in territories and political, collectivities. But it's, the language that is used is very similar to the language of conquest that one would read in the Old Testament, conquest for the promised land. And America for example, is seen either as a promised land that needs to be conquered or a kind of spiritual Babylon, a place of desolation, of spiritual desolation that needs to be invaded so that the kingdom of God will permeate American society. So this is very, very significant language that is used in the context of politics today to kind of delegitimize political adversaries. If you want to know more about this idea, I've written a book called American Evangelicals for Trump. I've dedicated an entire chapter to spiritual warfare. So thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope this very short presentation was useful.
Okay, and we thank André in his absence for that video presentation, making it plain, breaking down this concept of spiritual warfare. Next to the mic, we have Peter Montgomery, who is the research director at People for the American Way, where he oversees its Right Wing Watch project. Peter has studied the religious right and political allies for more than 20 years and is an expert on right-wing movements. Peter has contributed a chapter on the relationship between the Tea Party and the religious right in a book called Steep, The Precipitous Rise of the Tea Party. Peter's going to elaborate on this concept of demons and connect the dots between NAR and power. Peter?
Thank you, Naomi. It's really an honor to be part of the conversation today with a group of researchers and scholars from whom I've learned quite a bit. So People for the American Way's Right Wing Watch publishes daily reporting and analysis on the religious right and its political allies. And we hope that we could be a useful source for many of you. I was glad to see that one of our clips was in Professor Gagné's presentation. So the language of spiritual warfare and demons may be unfamiliar to a lot of Americans, but that does not mean that the New Apostolic Reformation is some kind of a fringe curiosity. It's closely connected to the highest levels of political power in the country. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the evidence of the movement's access and influence to that political power, which reached a peak during the Trump administration, but did not end when their hero was kicked out of office by the voters. So this national gathering for prayer and repentance took place earlier this year. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and a couple dozen members of Congress gathered with Che Ahn and other NAR leaders at the Museum of the Bible to pray and repent on behalf of the nation. The event was co-hosted by Apostle Jim Garlow and Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, which is a sign of the close ties between the NAR and what we might think of as more traditional religious right political groups. Johnson is one of the many Republican politicians who have taken part in prayer calls that Garlow began hosting in 2020 as part of the effort to keep Trump in power after he lost that election. On one of those calls, Johnson said that Garlow has had a profound influence on his life. NAR's influence in the broader movement was also evident in the spiritual warfare rhetoric that Perkins used at the event. He talked about demonic attacks and the battle in the heavenlies, which is kind of language we hear often from NAR figures. Members of Congress also used spiritual warfare rhetoric. Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, "We tie the hands of Satan and all his demons." Representative Greg Steube, "We bind the demonic forces of resistance and rebellion among God's people." Next slide. So spiritual warfare rhetoric is abundant in the MAGA movement. I was in Milwaukee last month for the Republican National Convention. The Heritage Foundation's event promoting the Project 2025 policy agenda was capped off by Tucker Carlson, who told attendees that they are engaged in a spiritual battle against anti-human forces that want to eliminate Christians. And this idea that the American political scene is not about left or right, or even Republicans versus Democrats, but a spiritual battle between good and evil has become commonplace. At the RNC, I heard it from Tucker Carlson, from a Moms for Liberty co-founder at their town hall, from RNC co-chair Laura Trump, and others. And the first speaker at an RNC prayer breakfast featuring J.D. Vance, Mike Johnson, and RNC Chair Michael Whatley was Paula White, who used the job that Trump gave her to keep a steady flow of NAR and Christian nationalist leaders going through the White House. She also prayed at Trump's January 6th rally, and on the campaign trail, she repeatedly denounced Trump's opponents as demonic. The middle image there is Donald Trump Jr. speaking with Gene Bailey, host of the show Flashpoint, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly highlight some events that are evidence of NAR leaders' proximity to power and their engagement in this year's elections. So the Courage Tour is something that NAR figures Lance Wallnau and Mario Murillo have teamed up with Turning Point USA for, and it's aimed at electing Trump by breaking demonic strongholds in swing states. Wallnau calls Vice President Kamala Harris the devil's choice. Murillo says her candidacy is a sign that demonic power is at work. The Reawaken America tour has been going on for a couple of years, and it's radicalized thousands of Americans by bringing together Trump family members, NAR and Christian nationalist figures, MAGA movement conspiracy theorists, and assorted extremists. Trump himself called into at least one of those. Flashpoint is a program on Kenneth Copeland's Victory Channel, which was started in the fall of 2020, and it's been a major source of misinformation about that election and the insurrection. Wallnau and other NAR figures appear regularly on the show and at its live events. And it was at a Flashpoint event that NAR leaders led the audience in making a Watchman decree that some of you may have seen. It became viral, that had people declaring the church to be God's governing body on earth. The first Flashpoint Live event this year was at NAR figure Andrew Womack's Bible College in Woodland Park, Colorado. And Womack's supporters took over the school board, but his then effort to take over the city council this year failed when voters rejected his candidates. Trump has rewarded Flashpoint's loyalty with a sit-down interview with host Gene Bailey at Mar-a-Lago last year. And I also have just in the last couple of days noticed that Flashpoint Live is in Milwaukee for the DNC, and Wallnau and Charlie Kirk have been on the show. Can we go back to our list here? Sean Foyt is a musician and political activist connected with NAR. He's been on a 50-state tour called Kingdom to the Capitol, where he holds worship at or outside of state capitol buildings and often gets public officials to appear with him. In Alabama, he was greeted by Chief Justice Tom Parker, sort of become infamous for his Christian nationalist ruling on IVF. Foyt has also held rallies on the National Mall and worship services in the U.S. Capitol attended by members of Congress. Then the last thing on this list is prayer calls. There are a lot of prayer calls. Garlow's well-versed ministry continues political prayer calls begun after the 2020 election, regularly has Republicans on there, Republican officials. Intercessors for America regularly has Republican officials on its calls. Its host, Dave Kubal, is very close to Paula White. Last year, Apostle Clay Nash hosted a 50-state series of prayer calls that featured Republican Party officials, state legislators, state Supreme Court candidates, and more. And these tours and calls point to the fact that while NAR is focused on changing the nation, transforming the nation, they're also focused on the state level, and some prophets have geographical assignments, like Abby Abildness and Julie Green in Pennsylvania, who were supporters of Doug Mastriano, the state senator who was the Republican nominee for governor in 2022. And Green has also spoken at Reawaken America. So the next slide is just a few things that are coming up for people to look forward to. Next month, religious right activists are starting a 50-day fight to mobilize spiritual warfare before the election. Jim Garlow is hosting the kickoff event on September 15th, although they have a couple preview events scheduled online. This image of Satan and his demons is from a promotion for the 2020 version of the 50-state fight, which called on God to have a second miracle and return Trump to office. Lou Engle, a longtime NAR leader, is calling for 1 million women and their families to shift history by rallying on the National Mall on October 12th for a last stand moment for America. Sean Foyt is bringing that 50-state kingdom to the Capitol tour to an end on the National Mall on October 26th. And this picture with Senator Josh Hawley is from one of Foyt's earlier events on the National Mall. And I didn't include on this slide, but the Family Research Council's annual Religious Right Activist Conference, Pray, Vote, Stand, will be held in DC October 3rd to 6th. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks so much, Peter, for helping us connect those dots and associating some of the NAR personnel, some of these names and faces. Thank you so much. Next to the mic, we have Julie Ingersoll, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, where she teaches and writes about religion and American culture. She focuses especially on religion and politics and the religious right. Julie is an expert on the religious right and Christian Reconstructionism, and is the author of several books and articles, including Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. Julie is going to talk to us about how not to think about dominionism and NAR, how we can get rid of misguided assumptions and oversimplifications, and instead look at the long-term time horizon of this movement. Julie.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have been invited to participate in this. I think it's a really important project, and I appreciate all the work that the SPLC and PRA is doing to make it happen. I'm going to quickly share a screen here and pull up the PowerPoint. There we go. So I want to talk to you about how we should not think about dominionism and the NAR. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Julie Ingersoll, and I'm always really happy to hear from folks. Okay, so I want to start with some definitions. I'll be talking about dominionism. This is a notion taken from the book of Genesis, where God told Adam and Eve to exercise dominion over creation. It developed into a theological strain and a project inside Protestantism among a group known as the Christian Reconstructionists in the 1960s and 70s. And this is the area of focus for my own research. Christian Reconstructionists were able to spread dominionism out through their own very narrow movement into the larger evangelical, conservative Christian, conservative Protestant subculture because of the Christian school movement and the Christian homeschool movements. And that's kind of the subject of my book. Reconstructionist and dominionism is theocratic and, to my mind, authoritarian. I'll also obviously be talking about the NAR, but I'm interested in the nexus between the NAR and the Christian Reconstructionists because the Reconstructionists built ties among charismatics to spread dominion theology in the 1980s. They argued that the charismatic movement was the most rapidly growing movement of Christians across the globe, and that if they could they could build in dominion theology, they could get it to spread. The NAR arose among Pentecostals and charismatics in the 1990s, and they developed their own variation on dominionism known as the Seven Mountains that you've already heard about. So I'm often asked by reporters, podcasters, other scholars even, is so-and-so a member of the NAR? Most recently, it's often been Mike Johnson. Is Mike Johnson a member of the NAR? And I want to suggest to you that that's the wrong question. It misconstrues how social movements work. And it doesn't focus on what really matters, which is the influence of these movements and the time horizon with which they are working. We think that social systems and religions are discrete, self-contained, bounded systems that have a coherent set of ideas. And so you're either in one group or in another group, but not both. We think that way because we have this structure. Often, actually, in terms of in the study of religion, we have it because we have these structures called world religions that we imagine to be discrete and self-contained and separate from each other. But that's just a way of thinking about the world. In reality, people on the ground in everyday lives pick and choose the parts they want to pay attention to, and they cobble together what works for them in any given context, in response to any given set of questions. But those don't necessarily match up with the discrete, self-contained social systems. So dominionism in the NAR is a fluid assemblage of ideas, traditions, and practices that are invoked as applicable. It's incredibly diffused by design because that's much harder to counter. And affiliation with the dominionism or the NAR is often disclaimed by people where the evidence of influence is easily observed, but the identification with it is disclaimed because people don't think they don't want to be associated with groups that, for example, advocate theocracy. And even sometimes the influence people are unaware of the influence. So the way that dominionism spread throughout the Christian school movement and the Christian homeschool movements means that there are people who have drunk from the well of Christian Reconstructionism, even without recognizing it necessarily. So here's an example of this. I often have people tell me that the NAR can't be dominionist. In fact, I was engaged in a conversation with somebody on Twitter about this very point yesterday. They say this because the NAR is Pentecostal, and Pentecostals are premillennialist. That is, they think the world is going to get worse and worse until the rapture and the tribulation when Jesus returns. This is the version of end times theology that you know from popular culture. And dominionists, Reconstructionists, are postmillennialists. That is, they think that the kingdom of God is established at the resurrection, and it's their job to build it. And in a sense, these theological systems as beliefs aren't necessarily compatible, although they may not be as incompatible as we often think they are on first glance. But let's set that aside for a moment. The two different versions of what the end of the world will look like are brought together by the practice on a day-to-day level of dominionism. And this is the influence of these movements. It's more important than the belief systems themselves. Dominionism gives them a time horizon that we don't often enough grapple with. A millennium is 1,000 years. And so sometimes these folks are talking about tasks that they expect to take 1,000 years to bear fruit. But even in their smaller versions of it, a homeschool ministry was selling homeschool families a workbook in order to build a 200-year plan for family dynasties. So they're thinking in maybe 1,000 years, but at least 200 years. And so trying to meet those kinds of movements when focused on the current election or a current global crisis isn't going to work. We need to think about the long-term influence of these movements in order to address them. And one way you can do this, one way you can identify the influence of the movement, apart from trying to label certain people as in or out, is to listen carefully to their language, to develop an ear for the kinds of terminology that they use and learn to identify it. So if you hear the words, if you hear prophecy or spiritual warfare or apostles used in a modern, non-metaphorical way, you are hearing somebody that is drawing from the new Apostolic Reformation. If you hear somebody talking about a biblical worldview, if you hear them talk about patriarchy used in a positive way, if you hear them talk about government schools instead of public schools, or civil government instead of government, biblical spheres of authority, the notion of dominion, and more recently, a discussion about something called lesser magistrates and covenant marriage. Those are things that we could talk about in the discussion if you're interested. But if you hear people using this language, they are drinking from this well of Christian Reconstructionism. Dominionism and the NAR come from a convergence of older forms and categories of Christianity. They have coalesced around Donald Trump, but he's not the source of them. These movements are theocratic and authoritarian, and they're a profound threat to democracy. But we need to remember that efforts to label someone as a member are distracting. If someone asks me, is Mike Johnson a dominionist? And I say yes, and he says no, we're done talking. Or we get drawn into a debate back and forth on whether or not he is, which is kind of irrelevant. Instead, we need to identify the places where the influence has taken hold plan for the long term and stay engaged. Again, thank you for your presence here and your attention. This is a really important topic.
Thank you so much, Julie. I think the last time we had this conversation, I was telling you that I was taken right back, transported back to some of the religious communities that I was familiar with when I was a child. Some of this language is very familiar to me. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Rachel Tabachnik, who is an expert on Christian Zionism and Dominionism. Rachel is a former fellow with Political Research Associates and a contributor for 10 years to the group blog Talk to Action. She's been interviewed on the topic of NAR on NPR, and her work at the intersection of religion and policy has been cited in major media outlets and academic and nonprofit publications. Rachel is going to engage us on this topic of theocratic libertarianism. Rachel?
Thanks so much. I set up my screen. There you go. So I'm talking about the paradox of theocratic libertarianism, an oxymoron if there ever is one, but I think it's helpful to understand this. So you've probably heard enough already to know that the mission of the New Apostolic Reformation is taking dominion over society and government. And in his book, Dominion, Peter Wagner claims the current mountains are controlled by a government of Satan, and it will take a government of God to overthrow them. So the question I'm trying to answer here is, how can a movement that is theocratic, anti-pluralistic, and anti-democratic market itself under the banner of liberty? How can they see themselves as the freedom fighters against tyranny? Now, we've already mentioned Christian Reconstructionism and how NAR draws from Christian Reconstructionism. Wagner talks about it in his book. And one of the things that happens here is that NAR is an amorphous, loosely organized movement without well-developed theological foundations. So they've drawn from Christian Reconstructionism, which is a much smaller movement, but one with libraries of publications explaining in detail how this dominionism is supposed to take place. Picture a movement cranking out something like a Project 2025 volume every few months. So if you've heard about Christian Reconstructionism, you probably know that it's about reconstructing the nation under biblical law, including things like capital punishment for blasphemy, adultery, incorrigible juvenile delinquency, homosexuality, abortion, as well as advising someone to get an abortion. But these same Christian Reconstructionist thinkers think that you can be a theocrat and a libertarian at the same time. I'm going to show you now a quote from one of the founders, Rousas Rushdoony. Few things are more commonly misunderstood than the meaning of theocracy. It is commonly assumed to be a dictatorial rule by self-appointed men who claim to rule for God. In reality, theocracy in the Bible is the closest thing to radical libertarianism that can be had. So the founders of Christian Reconstructionism, Rushdoony and his son-in-law, Gary North, were indeed radical libertarians of a sort. They were libertarians in the sense that reconstructing America means deconstructing the state. There would be no Ayatollah-like figures over a powerful central government because there would be no powerful central government. But they're also not anarchists or egalitarians. This would be a bottom-up theocracy, what they call theonomy, or rule by God's law. So the void left by the deconstruction of the central state is filled by government at the family level, government at the church level, and a local civil government. This hierarchy, the patriarchal family, government, and authoritarian church government, is part of God's ordered liberty and described as not the same as the oppressive rule of elites in cahoots with the state. And adhering to the guidelines of this God's ordered liberty is supposed to bring about prosperity and human flourishing. So one of the major themes of Christian Reconstructionism is that there can be no neutral law or education, and therefore no religious pluralism. And this is where the fight against tyranny supposedly comes in. According to Rushdoony and North, Secular humanism, the enemy of Christianity, is now the religion of our nation, and it's imposed by the federal government. So they are the freedom fighters working to get the federal government off your back. They are the freedom fighters against tyranny. So this movement is also a primary source of what has been called biblical economics that's being taught all over the country through homeschooling and in many private schools. And biblical economics provides justification for an economic system in which property rights are supreme, and there will be no public education, no government-sponsored welfare or safety nets, no taxes over 10%, and no minimum wage or labor laws. My fellow panelist, Peter Montgomery, has written in the past, this is a Bible the Koch brothers can love. So Rushdoony and North certainly weren't the first people in America to connect these kind of economic and political ideas to the Bible, but they did something that others had not. They built an entire systematic theology, complete with thousands and thousands of pages, claiming biblical support for this plan. In other words, think of it as like a massive Project 2025 set of blueprints. And in these blueprints, these were edited by North in the 1980s. We can see roots of things that seem to have just come from nowhere in recent years. Biblical justification for private militias and church militias, biblical arguments against gun laws, guidelines for local leaders to resist federal regulatory agencies if their actions are not deemed biblical. This is what Julie was talking about, the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. And despite this militant language, they still insisted that this was not leading to a violent revolution. This would, as Julie also said, take hundreds and hundreds of years and having lots of children and raising them in this worldview. One of the people who's been successful at this sort of slow motion bottom-up revolution is Doug Wilson, who describes himself, as you can see on this video, as a theocratic libertarian. Limited government is a theocratic necessity, according to Wilson. He states that the first thing that should happen in a biblical law order is that the EPA, IRS, and the Department of Education would be abolished. And he has been pretty successful in building a model of this slow motion revolution in Moscow, Idaho. Wilson has moderated his stance somewhat on some of the more draconian aspects of Christian Reconstructionism. And in recent years, he has gained a national audience in some circles. For example, at the recent National Conservatism Conference in DC, the now new right, he was a speaker, and you can see him here with a list of speakers that include Kevin Roberts, who's head of the Heritage Foundation, and the vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance. And in fact, he was not only a speaker, but he was in a special panel with Al Mohler, one of the most prominent Southern Baptists in the country. And Al Mohler says that Christian Reconstructionism is currently undergoing a revival. So this is granted a small movement. It continues to be a small movement, but it has spread throughout the country in ways that you might not expect. One, Julie's already mentioned, they've had a huge impact in homeschooling. They also had an impact on the Christian right infrastructure that was being built in the 1970s and the 1980s. Another one that might surprise you is in the libertarian infrastructure. Gary North was a fellow at a significant libertarian think tank, Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, from the time the think tank was formed until his death a couple of years ago. The person associated with this think tank that you might be most familiar with is Ron Paul. And in fact, Gary North was the creator of the Ron Paul homeschool program. So there are not a lot of Christian Reconstructionists at this think tank, but there are a lot of fellow travelers. For example, there are Catholic versions with a similar anti-statist and economic worldview. And there are secular versions that blend this type of economic vision with traditionalism, we could say. And actually, there are a number of prominent people in the tech world who have embraced this type of libertarianism. So Julie has already, Julie has written in the past, and I want to promote her book here, about how Christian Reconstructionists had quite a bit of stealth activity during the Tea Party movement. And there were actually Tea Party websites. There were actually Christian Reconstructionist websites with Gary North and other leaders. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes, this movement has spread now through the New Apostolic Reformation, which we're talking about. So where does the New Apostolic Reformation come into this story? And although we don't have time to talk about that at length, I just want to use a quote from Gary North, who says, "This is one of the most fundamental realignments in U.S. Protestant history." Now, these movements are different, but they share some similar end goals. They have some of the same libertarian sounding appeals. It's very dualistic. You're with us or against us. Our enemies are the enemies of God. They're socialists, they're communist, or they're demons. So this anti-statism can be seen also in the movement. This is an example of one of the leaders saying that the American government takes 50-50 with you when you partner with them. God only requires 10%. Another example is the leading apostle who says, "The kingdom of God will not be socialism, but a freedom even greater than anyone on earth knows at the time." And then he goes, well, at first it may seem like totalitarianism. And then he goes into all kinds of spiritual warfare language. And so one of the things that happens here is it's hard to tell, if we're talking in the spiritual realm or in the worldly realm. But some of the apostles and prophets aren't interested in waiting around for hundreds of years, like the Christian Reconstructionists say. And in fact, their need to accelerate the movement is a source of conflict. Understanding this libertarian anti-statist aspect of dominion theology can help us better comprehend the support for Trump as the chaos candidate and the wrecking ball that destroys the tyranny of the state and ends the current reign of the so-called satanic elites over the 7 mountains. And at least some of the apostles and prophets in the movement appear to be willing to advance this timetable, go to a top-down model. They see Jesus as stuck in heaven, unable to come to earth until they do their job in taking dominion. And they want it to happen in their lifetimes. And so if they have to use the evil state or burn down the evil state to do it, so be it. So understanding this paradox, the libertarian component of these movements is crucial, I think, to understanding the appeal to large grassroots populations, as well as the appeal to those who have been willing to take advantage of the opportunity to advance the economic libertarian part of the movement. But it's also key in understanding the tensions, conflicts, and major weaknesses of the movement. And let us take hope, because just as Project 2025 has revealed that, American people don't really want what's in these 900 pages. I think the same thing applies to this movement. And thank you so much for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much, Rachel, for that. We're going to turn to strategy now and hear from Frederick Clarkson, who is a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates. Fred has written about politics and religion for 4 decades, and his work has appeared in a wide range of publications. He's the author and co-author or editor of several books, including Dispatches from the Religious Left, The Future of Faith and Politics in America. Fred's going to talk about the NAR's 19-county strategy and what we can do to counter it. Fred?
Get off mute. Okay, thank you, Naomi, and everyone. So good to be with such a wonderful group of researchers and scholars who just given us a sampler of what each of them can do. Any one of them could have carried this entire webinar and kept it interesting. The ancient Chinese poet and military philosopher Sun Tzu advised that to gain victory, you do not attack the enemy. You attack the enemy's strategy. Good news for those of us who seek to preserve and advance democracy and its institutions is that we know a great deal about the strategy of the Christian right. You've heard some of it over the past few minutes, providing us the basis for developing a counter-strategy. In July of 2023, an NAR leader, Apostle Lance Wallnau, and the First Policy Institute, a MAGA think tank in Washington, launched what they called Project 19. They knew that their candidate for president in 2020 had lost by only a few thousand votes in key states, and they aimed to make up the difference this time. Ashley Hayek of the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI, who runs Project 19, previously served as the National Coalitions Director for the Trump 2020 campaign. For his part, Lance Wallnau says he's engaged in the battle for the mountain of government that we've heard about, and that there are 3,143 counties in the United States, and that the Lord showed us that 19 are going to determine the future of America. Their 19-county strategy targets suburban counties in 9 swing states, where the evangelical vote in 2020 was proportionately less than elsewhere. So they began last year by getting pastors to speak about voter registration before registering their congregations. Chad Wolf of AFPI, who was an acting Secretary of Homeland Security in the Trump administration, reflected the broad strategy of the Christian right when he said that 30 to 40 million evangelicals don't vote every cycle, and that if even an infinitesimal percentage of those people get involved, we'll never lose. Part of the effort to find these prospective suburban kingmakers is the Courage Tour, led by Apostle Lance Wallnau and conducted in the style of an old-fashioned summer tent revival. The tour seeks to embolden reluctant conservative evangelicals in blue suburbs and make them feel part of a religious and political cause far greater than themselves. In Arizona, Wallnau sought to find and train activists for early voter engagement in Latinx precincts in Maricopa County. There, they want to contact unregistered and infrequently voting Christians with an aim to plan for early voting. The rules and timeframes for early voting vary from state to state, but in Arizona, it begins 27 days, almost 4 weeks before Election Day, giving organizers plenty of time to get their voters to the polls. Here, Wallnau was explaining, while the Vita Church pastor translates, how to find voters in the precincts identified by number on the map. These precincts, he said, are within striking distance of Vita Church, to where the devil's got a stronghold that God wants to break up. The Courage Tour was the branded effort, but Wallnau and others have been quietly visiting Maricopa County and elsewhere many times during this voter development campaign. They are joined in Project 19 by several dozen partners, including such established Christian right groups as the Family Research Council, the Family Policy Alliance, Faith and Freedom Coalition, and Turning Point USA. Beyond their efforts at voter mobilization is something far more concerning, however. Wallnau and other NAR leaders are increasingly teaching that normal religious, political, and gender differences are to be seen as supernatural evil, as demonic. This is part of the volatile spiritual warfare of which André and Peter and Rachel have spoken. In March, in another appearance at Vita Church, Wallnau said, God told him, my people aren't praying strong in the spirit, and if we don't have apostles and prophets in the territory, then demons control the territory, and the minds of people are under the influence of devils. The left is loaded with demons, Wallnau has also warned. I don't think it's people anymore. I think you're dealing with demons talking through people. When the Courage Tour hit Wisconsin in July, scholar Matt Taylor, who was there, reports that about 2,500 people attended and some 50,000 people followed the live stream on Facebook. But after a year of preparation for voter mobilization, and with additional Courage Tour stops in Georgia and Michigan, they are now also recruiting and training election workers and poll watchers. Their election integrity specialist at the Wisconsin event was Joshua Caleb Standifer, who leads an organization called Lion of Judah, which says it wants Christian patriots to reform the mountain of government. He urged those who've been pumped up with election denialism and conspiracy theories to be a Trojan horse in the electoral system and to be the ones counting the votes. Meanwhile, it's just been announced that the Courage Tour will be in Pennsylvania, September 27th and 28th. Now, I realize that presentations like this can leave us with a sense that there's nothing we can do. But as I mentioned, the good news is that we know that a key element of the strategy of the Christian right relies on the tools of electoral democracy. And these same tools are available to the rest of us. These tools are so readily available that we do not necessarily have to wait for permission from political parties or interest groups to act. It's fine if we have those connections, of course, but it's also possible to do it ourselves or with groups of like-minded people. However, while there are many fine organizations that encourage voter registration and mobilization, very few tell you very much about early voting, especially exactly when it begins. But there are good ways to learn about this and other aspects of voter access, and I'll put some of the best links in the chat. But these include governmental sources like the United States Election Assistance Commission, which will direct you to the websites of the Secretary of State for each state. The National Conference of State Legislatures has excellent resources about online voter registration, in-person early voting, and drop boxes. Vote411.org, a project of the League of Women Voters, has a state-by-state chart of the rules on voter eligibility, registration, absentee ballots, and early voting. Now, it's always been the strategy of the Christian right to master the tools of democracy in order to erode and to end it. The new focus on early voting in suburban areas and swing states is but the latest evolution. We have the tools to thwart their plans available to us as well. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Fred. To close us out in this portion of our conversation, we have Dr. Anthea Butler, who is Geraldine R. Segal Professor in American Social Thought and the chair of the Religious Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Butler is an historian of African American and American religion, and her research and writing spans African American religion and history, nationalism, race, politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. She's the author of a new book, White Evangelical Racism: The Politics of Morality in America, and she writes for MSNBC. Dr. Butler, give us a closing call to action. What should we be thinking about after hearing all of this?
Hi, Naomi. Thank you. And thanks to all of my colleagues and participants today for giving us great information and a lot of things to work with. But let me summarize all of this for you in one big thing. All of these tactics, all of these organizations will be behind the Republican Party this fall for the presidential election and for down ballot elections. I want to start off by where Fred left off to say voting is crucial, but voting isn't the only thing. One of the things I think that people need to recognize and realize about these movements is that they are well organized, interconnected, and they follow each other in different kinds of ways. And you will see that happening this fall and beyond. No one should think, given what happened on January 6, 2021, that this election is going to be a regular election in any way, shape, or form. One of the things that you've heard is how the Democrats have been demonized and Kamala Harris has been called Jezebel and all of these things. This theme of spiritual warfare will become very big, and this will surround the election cycle from here on out. You will hear lots of negative kind of language. You will hear many of these groups and people try to subvert the ways in which the election is happening and to also talk about the ways in which Democrats are liberal, godless, demonic, all of this kind of language. Language becomes very important in these movements, and I think that we need to pay more attention to that. But even more importantly is, I think one of the things that we could not talk about here is follow the money. Organizations like Family Research Council and Turning Point USA are very well funded, and you will see them in your neighborhoods and going around to get people in. So one of the things that you need to do is, if you have relatives, if you have friends, people who belong to these kinds of organizations or churches or wanting to go to these meetings, you need to talk to them about what it is that they're actually signing into. People begin to think about this as a way that, oh, they're trying to get children and we need to protect the family and we need to protect life. But the way in which you need to start to talk about this is that people are after power. And if you understand that these organizations are not just about religious organizations and that we should have religious freedom, but that they are religious organizations that are in fact designed to turn away freedom, that they are looking for authoritarianism, that they are looking for the end to democracy, then I think you will begin to understand the kind of threat that we have in this country about these things. And this is not just in this country, but it is worldwide. If you think about what happened with Brazil and Jair Bolsonaro, if you think about the ways in which this has happened in India with Narendra Modi and, Hindutva, or if you think about Russia and Ukraine right now and the ways in which Vladimir Putin has linked himself to the Orthodox Church to give away a kind of a religious nationalism. I think you need to think about how that has happened here in the United States and how Trump is trying to link himself to that. One of the more important questions I think that I keep coming up with when people want to talk to me about this is how people think, well, how do evangelicals consider this? How can Christians consider this? How can they even think about this? You need to think about this as not just religion anymore, but about politics and about the political power that comes ensued when you inscribe religion on top of political power. And I think that will be the question not to ask this cycle, but the question you should ask during this cycle is how are these things in operation in your community? Those of us who are like Naomi and I, who are in the Pennsylvania area, know that in places like Lancaster and others, the NAR has gotten a big stronghold, and all of these people are going to be coming through Pennsylvania because it is a big state for the election cycle. Those of you who are in states like this or in areas should also know that look out for these people when they come through. When you see these meetings happen on television, begin to talk to people about why you shouldn't listen to Sean Foyt, or why that worship meeting is not just a worship meeting, but it's a political meeting, right? And so I think that once we start to begin to think about these things as not just simply, religious aberrations, but religious aberrations that are coming in to undermine democracy, then you get a better sense about what the plan is and what these groups are trying to do in order to subvert the rights of every citizen in this country. I also want to talk about this in terms of certain kinds of issues just very quickly. If we begin to think about issues like immigration, sexuality, and others, this rhetoric is going to be used very strongly throughout the rest of the election cycle, and you need to pay attention to that. This is not just a Protestant thing, this is Catholics too. We had a lot of Catholic priests in 2016 and 2020 vilifying Democrats and others and Democratic candidates. Those of you who are Catholics out here, you need to listen to this. Mormons, everybody else. All of this happens within all of these religious frames. All of these ideas that we've talked about today that are new Apostolic Reformation ideas are not simply encased in Protestantism, but they are encased in different kinds of religious milieus. And that is helpful to these groups in order to create these kind of alliances together and the ways in which they think about stripping down democracy. So what are we saying here? You heard a lot of information. There's more things that we can point you to. They're in the chat. What we are saying is this: we are asking you not to just simply listen to this meeting, but to actually take hold of this information, begin to disseminate it to other people, to talk about it with your friends and your neighbors, with people in your family that may be actually real believers in all of this and sending their money to it. Let them know that their money is not going towards what they think it is. Their money is going towards things to power these meetings, to provide lavish trips for some of the leaders like Charlie Kirk and others and Lance Wallnau. It is something that is being used to ascribe power. And that is the important part of all of this. We want people to have religious freedom in this country. What we don't want is people to have religious freedom to abuse others. And that is what the NAR wants. I think it's really important to stress that the new Apostolic Reformation is actually the new authoritarian Reformation. It's the Reformation that wants to bring in authoritarianism and fascism into this country. And if you pay attention to it like that, and you realize what people have done with all of these structures, then you will begin to realize that this is not simply some benign religious movement, but it is a very insidious plan to take over this nation, to strip us from democracy, and to other people into a space where it makes it very easy for the kinds of things that we have seen happening around the world with wanton killings and ways in which people have been demonized in order to say that one group of people is better than another. Thank you so much, and we look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you so much, all of you, for giving us in just an hour so much rich information about this movement. We got some great questions, so I want to get right into it. I want to pick up on a theme, Dr. Butler, that you pointed out early in your remarks about how this is a well-funded, or these are well-funded coordinated movements. One question that has come through is, do we know anything more specifically about who's funding the NAR movement or its apostles and prophets?
I think Peter would be a great person to answer this question. Let me just answer it in a basic kind of way. There are a lot of rich conservatives who have poured money into these organizations. And then it's also the regular everyday people who, just like in the 80s, between TBN and PTL and all these other kinds of evangelists, are sending money to these organizations every day. I mean, I subscribe to some of their mailing lists, and it's kind of amazing to watch how the calls go out for donations, and this is the last chance you'll have, and this is where we have to save our nation. It's all the fundraising for regular people is all couched in the kind of language that I believe is not just incessant, but it's also apocalyptic. It's the kind of language that makes you think if you don't give your money, it's going to all end soon, and this is the last election, and we will never have something again. And that brings out people to give money. So while it's very hard to really track all of this, think about it as sort of this is going to ratchet up as we begin to see the Democrats get more and more money, right, for this new campaign. You're going to see a big amount of fundraising, I think, for all of these kinds of groups.
Peter, did you want to weigh in on that? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say it's very hard to talk about money and also to talk about specific numbers. I saw someone ask how many Americans we can consider part of this. A few years ago, Richard Flory and Brad Christensen did a book on what they call Inc. Christianity Independent Network Charismatic, of which they consider NAR to be a part. And while it's hard to quantify, it is the fastest growing part of American Christianity and perhaps the fastest growing part of Christianity in the world. So you have a lot of big successful ministries, as Dr. Butler said, that raise a lot of money. You have people like Lance Wallnau, who's one of the premier figures. He's also a real entrepreneur. He's like an executive coach and a speaker, and he's got tons of books, and he's constantly marketing materials. And that's kind of true of all of these ministry leaders. They support each other. They send people to each other's conferences. So it's a money-making operation that does not just rely on sort of tithes and offerings like a regular church. And there's a lot of media associated with it. So, Flashpoint is on Kenneth Copeland's Victory Channel. Of course, Kenneth Copeland is a big prosperity gospel proponent. So I think they have a lot of different sources of income. And then some of the political groups that are aligned with it, like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, which has become increasingly a Christian nationalist that is associated with some of these folks, he gets money from mega conservative donors.
Kind of following this thread of how can we understand the infrastructure here around these movements, there's a question about how this movement organizes at scale in the absence of a centralized organizational structure. What explains the ability to spread this ideology so quickly without that kind of organizational structure? The person who asked the question suggested that perhaps some specific anxieties are being tapped into. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, Anthea is the one who's written the book about this. And a couple of people have said this in the chat and the Q&A too. They want to know the connections between racism and this. And certainly as far as Christian Reconstructionists go, they basically single-handedly brought Southern Presbyterian pro-slavery theology into the 20th century. So from my point of view, there's that. But Anthea's book, please, Anthea, talk.
I'm sitting here being quiet because I'm like, let me just go put this in the chat for everybody.
Yeah.
The anxiety is race. The anxiety is the death of whiteness. The anxiety is white people not being able to, continue to gain power. This is this is very much the core of the Trump campaign and the core of many of these groups right now is basically it's about whiteness. So if we want to talk about that, what we need to talk about is declining birth rates. This is why you just hear J.D. Vance saying all this stuff about, childless women and grandmothers are only supposed to take care of babies and do nothing else. And I really resent that like completely. And I'm thinking about this in terms of how everything gets positioned. So you have to not just think about race, but you have to think about how these groups think about family, how they posit leadership. It's all patriarchal, it's white male headship. You have to start to think about the ways in which we have these trad wives and women who are, showing you all the domestic kind of nice things that they're doing, and you just think it's an Instagram, but it's really to pull you into something like this and to pull you in these kinds of groups like Julie and others have talked about today. This is very important, and I think that for the election cycle, you're going to hear this vilification of race and racism over and over and over again about how, Trump and others and Charlie Kirk and others will talk about this. This is why we have textbook campaigns, folks. This is why in Florida, people had to sign up so their kids would be able to learn about Black History Month because, basically the governor didn't want you to learn about that. I just saw this whole thing this week where they just threw away, thousands and thousands of books out of one of the libraries in Florida. This connects to everything, but at ground level zero, it is about race and whiteness, and it's the scourge of this country, and it continues to be for both evangelicals and Catholics and others. One of the biggest problems we have with religion in this country is racism. When King said the most segregated hour in America was 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, what he could have said is the most segregated hour, the most segregated time, the most segregated everything is when we get to an election cycle, when people have to start to think about whether or not they want to vote for somebody who doesn't look like them.
Let me add to that, at the same time, we see that this movement is spreading throughout the world and all different populations around the world and has become quite popular in minority communities in this country. And so they are able to somehow spread the same angst into those communities that Anthea is talking about have been spread into a lot of white working class communities, for example. And so they have had the capability of doing that. And one of the ways that this information is disseminated is that if you think about these loose groups under these apostles and prophets, there are apostolic hubs that some of the major apostles work out of. So you do have, while you don't have what you think of as typical institutions, you do have these apostolic hubs. And these apostolic hubs will have training centers. So for example, back when C. Peter Wagner was alive, there was the Wagner Leadership Institute. And now you see hubs associated with many of the different major apostles. So there are some centers, although they don't look like centers of denominational entities. And I want to go back to the other question just for a moment here too, and say that there is some money that goes directly into this movement from people like Ken Eldredge. You might not be familiar with him, but he's a Silicon Valley figure who has funded the transformation movies and a lot of campaigns in this movement. And so there is money that is flowing. It's very hard to follow. And again, much of this has come through adjacent entities like Family Research Council, American Family Association. Money flows into those and helps prop up these movements by their associations. And then one last quick point. One of the things that we see is a lot of money and effort goes to discrediting other Christian groups. So that's the main point I wanted to try to make here. Discrediting denominations and parts, and even inside of their own denominations, discrediting those who have different beliefs different politics, and particularly those who are social justice oriented. So I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you so much, Peter. Go ahead. I see you got your hand up.
Just a couple of real quick other things on that question about how they have influence without structure, so much structure. In addition to the kind of hubs and networks that Rachel talked about, they have some major media operations. They've got cable networks. They've got Charisma, which is a multimedia platform that regularly promotes these guys and publishes their books. And so that's one way that they have influence. And then specifically on the ground, kind of hardcore voter turnout influence is their connection with evangelical groups that are very structured to do that kind of work. My Faith Votes, the Faith and Family, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, the group AFA, FRC. So these prophets and apostles have influence through their networks and through their media, and they're able to have political influence on the ground through their associations with religious right groups that are specifically structured to have political impact.
Fred?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Rachel and Anthea are talking about. There's a paradox on the race issue with NAR because they are very explicitly multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multinational. And in contrast to the stereotype that we usually think of white Christian nationalists, they often have women in leadership. So there are women apostles and women prophets and African-American prophets and apostles, and even, African apostles who have influence in the United States. It's not a one-way street, in the way of colonialism. It's a global movement with influences going back and forth. That's really important to see that. And they understand themselves as living in a transcendent moment of the kingdom of God advancing, and themselves as God's army in bringing the end times into the present. So when we talk about spiritual warfare, we see this merger of people and the supernatural at the same time. So if in their minds, racial and ethnic differences are not as important as the kind of religious and political and gender differences we've been talking about, so that other Christians, mainline Protestants that we've been talking about here, are seen as demonic because they're insufficiently Christian in the right ways and taking Christians in the wrong direction. And it's very important for other Christians to understand that, and for everybody to understand that it's not just about oppression of religious minorities. As far as they're concerned, mainstream Catholics, mainstream Protestants are equally evil to all of the minority and New Age religions.
Anthea?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to this that I put in the chat, and people might not have seen it. All of everything that everybody said is true, but at the core of this is something that I think we don't really consider when we think about all this, is the effects of capitalism. Part of this is very capitalistic, and capitalism can cross race, class, gender, all of this stuff. There's so much money and so much, power behind all of this that I think, especially in places like Brazil, Nigeria, which I've been to, and others, part of this has to do with the proximity to wealth and whiteness as power. And so you can have people who are different races, different ethnicities, but they are looking for where that power comes from. And so I think this is very important to think about in that context, that just because you see, a racially mixed group, I talk about this in my book, White Evangelical Racism, is that the default is white. And when the default is white, then you have to understand that for everybody else, it's about, basically, how can I aspire to this thing that these people who are in front of me have? So with the Wallnows, or if we want to go back to the beginning to see Peter Wagner's, it's important to see them as the avatars of the thing that everybody wants, right? And so if that's the thing that everybody wants, it doesn't matter what you look like. If you fall into line and behave like they want you to behave, and you get money and you do all of these things, then you become one of them, and you can say that everybody else is terrible.
Some great questions rolling in. One that commonly comes up when we talk about NAR and its influence and how they've been able to wield power is how can they do this and not have their tax status in jeopardy? And that question has come through. Can somebody briefly address that? Mm-hmm.
I put something in the chat about this. You could think about this with Family Research Council turning themselves into a church. I put a link up about this. You just basically turn yourself into a church. It's very easy in this country. You don't have to say that you're like just a regular org. You can become a church, and then you're tax exempt. And listen, I mean, the other part of this is that, you know, people always say this during an election campaign. Oh, why didn't they tell that pastor not to say this from the pulpit about voting for somebody? Well, you know, the IRS never goes after anybody for that. Okay. So I think that's really important to think about in terms of considering, you know, why this doesn't happen that way. It doesn't happen that way because it's not enforced.
Let me add something quickly to that. For those who don't know, if you are registered as a church, you don't have to file the 990 showing money coming and going. Okay. So one of the things that I saw quite a few years ago that aligns with what Anthea is saying is a lot of these ministries, which are sort of entrepreneurial entities, they're not churches. A lot of these apostles don't have churches. Okay. So they'd have a ministry, it'd be registered, they'd file their 990s. And then some years ago, somehow word got around, oh, just file as a church. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. So if you're filing as a church and then you follow the 7 Mountains mandate, okay, and if education is a ministry and if media is a ministry, then you can build entities and not file those also.
Wow. Thank you so much.
It's also true that elements of this thing don't file with the government at all because they don't believe in registering with the government. And people like Matthew Trewhella, you know, they don't want to have social security numbers or marriage licenses either because it's complicity with the institutions of tyranny in their view to do those things. They don't care about their C3 tax status. They don't have one. They don't want one. They don't want to be sharing information with the government or to have any government control over their what they do and how they do it in any way whatsoever. Hence the libertarian idea.
So just to add on to this, we have long had this effort to moderate religious freedom claims by making exemptions to otherwise applicable laws. And the one that comes to mind is the Seventh-day Adventist woman who couldn't work on a Sabbath, right? And the court said, well, we should carve out a space for her to not have to work on a Sabbath, or she should get her unemployment insurance. But that doesn't work when you have religious groups who now claim that there is no sphere of life that is outside of religious. So this is how you get Supreme Court cases like the Hobby Lobby decision, for example. So it isn't just ministries or even things that might be reasonably construed as ministries, even if you don't like them. Hobby Lobby is a business. And the Supreme Court has said that they have religious freedom rights as a business. These folks don't think that any part of life is outside the realm of religion.
So good, so good. I want to just take ask one more question. There's some questions that have come in about strategy, like what do we do? What do we do at the level of theology? You know, how can other Christian groups counter and confront NAR? Do we need new kinds of organizations, new kinds of groups? Talk to me about the strategies we should employ beyond having individual conversations, because I hear that, right? Individual conversations with people we're connected to. What else can we do to counteract and confront this?
Well, I'll jump in on that one because I wanted to respond to Mendy's question that arose from my presentation anyway. And she asked about this sort of thing, like how do I talk to my Christian friends who want to dismiss these movements as not Christian? And my first answer is I would interrogate them about what they mean by Christian, because these movements are Christian in any way that you can, I mean, they're not unorthodox in any theological sense. They all have specific antecedents to other parts of church history. And Christianity has changed over the centuries anyway. So there's that answer. But the other answer is the kind of thing that I'm trying to get at in my presentation, which is that we need to not get distracted in the conversation that's less important. So what if we're back and forth on whether or not they're really authentically Christian, if we decide they are, or if we decide they're not, what have we gained? We need to focus on what they're doing and be concerned about how to try to, so, you know, if somebody wants to dismiss dominionism because they don't think it's authentic Christianity, okay, don't call it Christian, call it whatever you want, but we need to pay attention to what they're doing because it's a real threat to democracy.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of tag on this and maybe make a couple of people mad and say theology is not the point. Okay, because if you get bound down in theology, it's not this place that people are operating from in these groups. Their belief system is movable and mutable. It is not static. And so when you have people who are given prophetic utterances every week about something, how can you talk about theology when somebody is saying, you know, well, the Lord said this and thus and so about Trump and what's going to happen in the election? Okay, because you're always going to move the goalposts. That's number one. Number two, it's not about the end times anymore. Forget about that. It's definitely not about the end times. This is about ruling and reigning on earth right now. And so for all of these groups, the way that you've got to talk to people is to talk to them about what are these groups destroying? What are they doing to civil society? What are they doing to, you know, basic Christian principles about peace, if that's the orientation you come from, okay? Because I don't think that just saying that they're not Christian, as Julie has said, is a helpful analysis here. What is more helpful is about the kinds of things that they are doing and what are they doing to each other and to other people that are, you know, not within the bounds of decent human dignity.
Peter?
Yeah, I would say we have one good model for the idea that knowledge is power with Project 2025, right? There's been a really broad effort to educate the public about how damaging that agenda is, and it's had a real impact on the public conversation. You know, thanks to the involvement of pop culture figures like Taraji P. Henson and others who have urge people to seek out the information, and there's a lot of people giving them that information. So I think what we're doing here is an effort to also bring knowledge to people who can spread it through their own networks, through their you know, their own platforms. And a lot of people have platforms these days. So I think you know, just sounding the alarm about what this movement is, what their goals are. You know, Professor Butler just made pretty clear their goal is dominion, and there's a lot of people who will not have the freedoms that they cherish if that kind of dominion is allowed to happen.
Fred?
Yeah, a lot of the reasons that we're in the situation that we're in now and facing the kinds of things we're facing now, and the reason we have to have this conversation because a culture of denialism has about the rise of the Christian right has ruled for 50 years. You know, whether it's the denialism about Christian Reconstructionism and dominion, about the nature of NAR, and NAR doesn't even exist to read some people. You know, democracy and religious freedom are important values of liberation and equality. And there have always been people, and there always will be people who don't agree with those things. And they're an organized and well-funded force, as we've discussed. If we allow a culture of denialism to exist on our religious and democratic institutions and anything else that goes on, we are walling ourselves off to the threat that we face. So I think we need to invite our friends who are in states of denial to begin to consider the implications of choosing to remain in ignorance, of choosing not to learn. And because all the things that they hold dear, all their most sacred and democratic values are at stake. And they risk that when they choose to remain in ignorance and deny the concerns that folks like us are raising.
Wow, what a rich and powerful conversation. Thank you all so much. There was a question that came through the chat from a student who wants to be able to follow up with panelists as they are able. And so, as a last question to you all, I want to ask you to either put in the chat or say aloud, how can people reach you if they have additional questions and want to follow up on this conversation? Fred, we'll start with you.
How to reach me? Well, I'm at Fred Clarkson on Twitter, and I'm easily available through my email address at PRA.
Thanks. Rachel?
Whoop, sorry, putting my email in the chat right now.
Great. Great. I see Peter did the same. Anthea did the same. Julie did the
I'm
same, or maybe
at
not. Go ahead.
Julie Ingersoll on Twitter and Blue Sky. And I'd
Okay.
love to hear from people.
Great.
Please do.
Great. Well, thank you all again for such a rich conversation. Thank you all attendees for hanging in there and asking such wonderful questions. I also want to say thank you to Koki Mendes, who is the communications director at PRA, who provided technical support and some promotional help for this webinar series. Thank you so much, Koki and Comms. Thank you all so much. The recording will be out soon. We hope that you will share it widely. Thank you so much. Stay tuned to PRA for more on the new Apostolic Reformation and what we can do to confront it. Thank you all so much.